The hospital room was quiet, except for the steady beep of the heart monitor. The air smelled of antiseptic and fading hope. Jean, a frail old man in his late 70s, lay in bed, his body weak, his breath shallow. The doctors had told him he didn't have much time left. He had made peace with that. He had lived a long life, one filled with love, loss, and memories that would soon fade into nothing. But there was one thing he couldn't leave behind, one regret that tugged at his heart even more than the thought of death itself. His dog, Max. Max had been his best friend for over a decade, a loyal golden retriever with warm brown eyes that seemed to understand everything John felt. They had been through so much together, long walks in the park, quiet nights by the fireplace, and those lonely days when Max was the only one who truly understood John's pain. But now, as he lay in this cold hospital bed, John hadn't seen Max in weeks. And all he wanted, more than anything in the world, was to see his furry companion one last time. The nurses hesitated at first. Hospital rules were strict. No pets allowed. But when they saw the way John's tired eyes pleaded with them, something in their hearts softened. The man had days, maybe hours left. Surely they could bend the rules just this once. They made a few calls, pulled a few strings, and soon arrangements were made. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, the hospital doors opened. A nurse stepped inside, holding the leash of a golden retriever. Max's tail wagged furiously. His ears perked up as he sniffed the air. He knew this place smelled different, but he also knew there was someone waiting for him. The moment they entered the room, John's eyes lit up for the first time in weeks. It was as if a flicker of life returned to him. His frail fingers trembled as he reached out, and Max, without hesitation, jumped onto the bed, pressing his warm body against John's side. "Hey, buddy," John whispered, his voice barely above a breath. His fingers ran through Max's golden fur, feeling its softness one last time. The room fell silent. The nurses watched, some with tears in their eyes. It was a beautiful moment, a man and his dog saying their final goodbye. But just as everyone thought this was the end, something happened. Max suddenly lifted his head, his ears twitching. His body tensed, his eyes locked onto John's face with an intensity no one had ever seen before. Then, without warning, Max let out a deep, low whine. His tail, which had been wagging moments ago, stilled. His breathing changed. And then, in the next few seconds, something so shocking happened that no one in that room would ever forget it. The room, once filled with quiet sniffles and the hum of machines, became eerily still. Max's deep brown eyes remained locked onto John's face, his body frozen in place. The usual warmth in his gaze had shifted. Something was different. His ears twitched again, his breathing deepened, and then, almost hesitantly, he leaned in closer, pressing his nose gently against John's cheek. The nurses exchanged glances. Something about the dog's behavior felt off. He wasn't just cuddling his owner. It was as if he sensed something no one else could. John, weak as he was, barely had the strength to lift his hand. But somehow he managed to touch Max's face. A faint smile tugged at his lips, but his voice was almost a whisper. "Max, you're here." Max let out another low whine. Then suddenly his entire posture changed. His ears flattened, his tail tucked slightly, and his muscles tensed. A soft growl rumbled in his chest, not out of aggression, but out of unease. It was subtle, but noticeable. One of the nurses, a young woman named Emily, took a cautious step forward. "Is he okay?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Another nurse shook her head. "I don't know, maybe he's scared." Hospitals can be overwhelming for dogs. But deep down, Emily wasn't convinced. She had seen therapy dogs come for patients before, and they never reacted like this. Dogs were intuitive. They could sense things humans couldn't. Fear, sadness, even sickness. But Max's reaction wasn't just sadness. It was something else, something she couldn't quite put into words. John, seemingly unaware of the dog's tension, continued stroking Max's fur. His fingers were weaker now, barely able to hold on. His breathing was slower, shallower. "Good boy," he murmured. "My best boy." Max let out another whimper, but this time he did something no one expected. He suddenly turned his head and looked straight at the heart monitor. The small screen blinked steadily, the beeping soft but consistent. It showed John's heart rate, low but still there. Max stared at it for a long moment, his body unmoving. Then, with slow, deliberate movements, he looked back at John, nudging his arm as if trying to wake him up. The nurses tensed. It was almost as if Max knew something they didn't. Emily felt a chill run down her spine. She had heard stories before of dogs sensing danger, predicting seizures, even alerting doctors before medical equipment did. But could Max be sensing something more? Something beyond what the machines were showing? John let out a shaky breath, his fingers barely gripping Max's fur now. His eyelids fluttered, and his chest rose and fell in weak, unsteady movements. Max whimpered again. Then, in a move that shocked everyone, he suddenly jumped down from the bed, ran toward the door, and barked. Loudly, urgently. The sound startled the nurses. Max had been quiet the entire time, but now his bark was sharp, demanding. He ran back to John's bed, then toward the door again. His tail was stiff, his ears fully alert. Emily's stomach twisted. She had seen dogs act this way before, but only when something was very, very wrong. She rushed to John's bedside, her pulse quickening. "Mr. Harrison?" she called gently, touching his arm. "John?" No response. Her fingers found his wrist, pressing lightly against his paper-thin skin. She held her breath. The beat was there. Faint, slow. Too slow. Then Max barked again. This time, louder. Desperate. Emily turned to the other nurse. "Call the doctor. Now." The other nurse didn't hesitate. She grabbed the emergency button, pressing it firmly. Within seconds, the room burst into motion. Footsteps thundered down the hallway as doctors and medical staff rushed in. One of them, Dr. Reynolds, immediately checked John's vitals. His brows furrowed. "His heart rate is dropping," he said urgently. "Get the crash cart in here. Now." Max whimpered again, stepping back as the room filled with people. His eyes never left John's face. He let out another soft whine, his body trembling slightly. Then, just before the doctors moved John's bed to begin emergency treatment, something strange happened. Max suddenly stopped whining. His ears perked up, his head tilted slightly. And then, just like that, he relaxed. His tail wagged softly, his tense posture eased. He took one slow step forward, then another, until he was right next to John's bed again. He sniffed the air, his nose twitching. For a brief moment, no one understood what had changed. And then John, who had been completely unresponsive just moments ago, let out a slow, weak breath. His fingers twitched ever so slightly. Dr. Reynolds, now pressing a stethoscope to John's chest, blinked in shock. "His vitals are stabilizing," he murmured. "I don't know how, but they're stabilizing." The nurses exchanged stunned glances. And through it all, Max just sat beside his owner, his tail wagging gently, his eyes soft and knowing. Emily stared at the golden retriever, her mind racing. What had just happened? What had Max sensed before anyone else did? And more importantly, what did he know that no one else did? The answer, whatever it was, would change everything. For a long moment, the room remained frozen. The tension, the confusion, the shock, it all lingered in the air, thick and unshakable. The doctors continued monitoring John, their hands moving quickly, their voices low but urgent. No one could explain what had just happened. Minutes ago, his vitals were dropping, his body slipping away. And then, just as suddenly, he stabilized. It defied logic. Emily found herself staring at Max, her heart pounding in her chest. The golden retriever sat patiently by the bedside, his gaze locked onto John's face as if waiting for something. His entire posture had changed. He was no longer restless, no longer whining. Instead, he was calm, as if he had known all along that this moment would come. Dr. Reynolds finally pulled back, letting out a slow breath. "He's stable for now," he said, though his tone carried an edge of disbelief. He looked at the nurses, then at Max, that dog. He knew before any of us did. No one responded. No one knew what to say. Outside the room, A few hospital staff had gathered, whispering among themselves. Word had spread quickly. Some of them had witnessed service dogs sensing medical emergencies before, but this was different. Max hadn't just sensed something was wrong. He had reacted in a way that almost seemed deliberate, as if he had been trying to warn them, as if he understood something that no machine, no human possibly could. Emily took a slow step forward, lowering herself to Max's level. "Hey, buddy," she whispered. "What is it? What do you know?" Max's brown eyes met hers for a brief moment before he turned his attention back to John. He let out a soft sigh and rested his head against the bed, closing his eyes. It was almost as if he was relieved. John, still incredibly weak, stirred slightly. His fingers twitched in the sheets, and though his eyes didn't open, his lips parted just enough to let out a whisper. "Max!" The room went completely still. Emily's breath caught in her throat. Slowly, she leaned closer. "John? Can you hear me?" His eyelids fluttered, his breathing still shallow. "Max," he repeated, his voice barely there. Then, with great effort, he moved his fingers, trying to reach for the dog. Max instantly responded, nudging his nose under John's hand, allowing him to feel his warmth. It was a small gesture, but it spoke volumes. One of the other nurses, a woman named Linda, placed a gentle hand on Emily's shoulder. "We should let him rest," she murmured. "Whatever just happened? He needs time to recover." Emily nodded reluctantly, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something bigger was at play. Later that night, long after visiting hours ended and the hospital halls grew quiet, Emily sat in the break room, staring at her untouched cup of coffee. The events of the day kept replaying in her mind. She had always believed that animals had a deep, almost unexplainable connection to their owners. She had read stories of dogs traveling miles to find their way home, of pets waiting for years after their owners had passed. But Max had done something that defied all logic. He had known John was slipping before the monitor showed any real danger. And then, just as suddenly when John stabilized, Max had relaxed, almost as if he had willed it to happen. She pulled out her phone and began searching. Stories of dogs sensing illness, predicting medical emergencies, even detecting cancer popped up. Some of them seemed plausible, backed by research, while others leaned more into the supernatural. Could Max be one of those dogs? Had he sensed something beyond what any human could? The thought sent a shiver down her spine. The next morning, Emily made her way back to John's room, expecting to find him resting. But when she arrived, she was surprised to see him awake, though weak, sitting up slightly with the help of an adjustable bed. Max was curled up at his feet, his head resting near John's leg. John's eyes, though tired, held a spark of something new, something Emily hadn't seen in them before. "You're awake," she said softly, stepping inside. John's lips curved into the faintest smile. "Yeah," he rasped. "Didn't think I would be." Emily hesitated before speaking. "John, what happened yesterday?" John's expression flickered, his fingers absent-mindedly stroking Max's fur. "I don't know," he admitted. "I remember feeling tired, like I was drifting." His voice grew quieter. "And then I heard him. Max. He was calling me back." Emily's heart skipped a beat. "Calling you back?" John nodded slowly. "It's hard to explain. I was somewhere else. Not a dream, not exactly. But it was peaceful, quiet. And then I heard Max barking. Loud, urgent, like he needed me." His fingers tightened slightly in Max's fur. "And suddenly, I wasn't there anymore. I was back." Emily swallowed hard, unsure of what to say. John turned his gaze toward her, his eyes filled with something unshakable. "That dog saved my life," he said, voice hoarse but steady. "And I think he knew exactly what he was doing." Emily didn't doubt it. But what she didn't know, what none of them knew, was that this was only the beginning. Something deeper was at play, and Max wasn't done yet. Equals 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 equals. John's words lingered in the air, heavier than anything Emily had expected. She looked at Max, who lay quietly at the foot of the bed, his warm brown eyes watching John carefully, as if still guarding him. There was something almost eerie about the way he hadn't left his side since the moment he entered the hospital room. It wasn't just loyalty. It was something deeper, something unexplainable. John sighed, his voice barely above a whisper. You know, I always thought dogs could sense things we couldn't. But this felt different. Emily swallowed, unsure how to respond. Every part of her training told her to focus on logic, on medicine, on science. And yet, she had been there. She had seen Max's reaction before any of the machines picked up John's decline. She had watched him panic, warn them, and then, almost miraculously, calm down just as John's vitals stabilized. It was impossible to ignore. A soft knock at the door broke the silence. Dr. Reynolds stepped inside, his usual stern expression softened with curiosity. "John," he greeted, glancing at the monitors. "You're looking better than expected." John chuckled weakly. "Guess I have my boy to thank for that." His hand rested gently on Max's back. The dog gave a slow wag of his tail, but didn't take his eyes off John. Dr. Reynolds sighed, crossing his arms. "That's actually what I came to talk about," he admitted. "The way Max reacted yesterday, it wasn't just coincidence. I've worked in hospitals for over 20 years, and I've seen therapy dogs sense when a patient is about to pass, but I've never seen anything like this. It's almost as if Max wasn't just sensing it. He was stopping it." John and Emily exchanged glances. Dr. Reynolds continued, his tone thoughtful. "I've been looking through your records. Your heart failure was progressing faster than we anticipated. Medically speaking, you should have gone into full arrest. But you didn't. Somehow, at the very last second, your body stabilized. And I can't explain why." A chill ran down Emily's spine. John exhaled slowly. "You're saying I should be dead?" Dr. Reynolds hesitated before nodding. "By all medical logic, yes. But you're not. And the only thing different in this equation is Max." Silence filled the room. Max, as if understanding the weight of the moment, let out a deep sigh and nudged John's leg with his nose. Emily finally spoke. "Dr. Reynolds, what are you suggesting?" The doctor hesitated. "I'm not suggesting anything yet, but I think we need to keep an eye on this. On Max. There's something about him, something unusual." John let out a dry chuckle. "He's always been special." Dr. Reynolds nodded, but remained unconvinced. "Special is one thing, but this is something else entirely." That night, the hospital halls were quiet, except for the occasional beeping of machines and the shuffle of nurses on their late-night rounds. Most patients were asleep, their rooms dimly lit. But in John's room, sleep didn't come easily. Max remained at the foot of the bed, his body alert even as his eyes drooped slightly. Emily, now off duty, sat in a chair nearby, unable to bring herself to leave. John shifted slightly, his breathing still weak but steady. "You should go home, Emily," he murmured. "You've been here all day." She shook her head. "I don't want to leave yet." John gave her a small, tired smile. "Worried about me?" She hesitated. "Worried about both of you." The room fell into silence again. Then, without warning, Max's ears perked up. His body tensed. Emily immediately sat up. "Max!" The golden retriever's head snapped toward the door. His fur bristled slightly, and then he growled. It was low, almost a rumble, but it was the first time he had made that sound since arriving at the hospital. John frowned. "What is it, boy?" Emily quickly stood, glancing toward the door. The hallway outside was dimly lit, empty. Nothing seemed out of place. Then Max's growl deepened. He stood up suddenly, stepping protectively in front of John's bed. His body was rigid, his eyes locked onto something unseen. Emily's heart pounded. She stepped closer to the door, peering out. But there was nothing there. The hallway stretched out in both directions, silent still. She turned back to Max. He was still tense, still staring. Then, without warning, he barked. Loud, urgent. John flinched. Emily's pulse spiked. Max ran toward the door, barking again. But at what? There was nothing there. Then, John gasped. Emily spun around just in time to see his body jerk slightly. His face twisted in pain. His fingers clutched at his chest. The monitors around him suddenly went wild, beeping, flashing, screaming warnings. John! Emily rushed to his side. Max barked again, frantic. John gasped for breath, his eyes wide with fear. It's happening again. Emily turned, slamming the emergency button. I need help in here. Footsteps thundered down the hall. Nurses and doctors burst into the room, their faces etched with urgency. Max refused to move. He stayed at John's side, barking relentlessly, his body pressed against the bed. Dr. Reynolds rushed in, assessing the monitors. His heart rate is dropping again. We need to act fast. Emily's heart pounded. This was just like before, but this time it felt different. Worse. Max's barking grew more desperate. He jumped onto the bed, pressing his head against John's chest. And then something happened. The monitors, still blaring in warning, suddenly flickered. Just for a second, John gasped sharply. His fingers twitched. And then, his heart rate stabilized. Again, the room went completely silent, except for the steady beeping of the monitor. The doctors, frozen in place, stared at the screen in disbelief. Max let out a soft whimper. Dr. Reynolds slowly removed his stethoscope, his face pale. That's impossible. Emily felt her knees go weak. John, his breathing ragged, reached for Max, his fingers brushing against his fur. His eyes, tired but sharp, met Emily's. This isn't just luck, he whispered. Max is doing something. Nobody disagreed. But the real question remained. What was Max stopping? And how much longer could he keep doing it? The room was eerily silent, except for the rhythmic beeping of the monitor. Every pair of eyes was locked on John, who lay there, his breathing uneven but steady. And then there was Max, silent now, but watchful, his body pressed close to John's as if acting as a shield. The tension in the air was almost suffocating. No one knew what to say. Dr. Reynolds ran a hand through his hair, his usual composed demeanor shaken. This shouldn't be happening, he muttered, more to himself than to anyone in particular. He looked at the screen again, as if expecting it to suddenly reveal some hidden answer. But there was nothing except the impossible fact that John's vitals, which had been plummeting, were now stable. Again, Emily could feel her own pulse hammering in her ears. She glanced at Max, who was still motionless, his ears slightly perked, as if he were waiting for something. Protecting, guarding. Then John, still weak, let out a breathless chuckle. Twice now, he murmured. His hand weakly patted Max's fur. He's done this twice. Emily swallowed hard. John, this isn't normal. John's tired eyes met hers. I know, he whispered. And that's when it happened. Max suddenly lifted his head and turned toward the door. His ears twitched, and then he let out a low, uneasy whine. His body tensed again, just like before. Emily and Dr. Reynolds both turned, expecting someone to walk in. But the hallway was empty. Then, Max stood up. His muscles were tight. His head held low as he took slow, deliberate steps toward the door. A deep growl rumbled from his throat, but this one was different from before. It wasn't aggressive. It was uncertain, almost like he was sensing something neither of them could see. Emily's stomach twisted with unease. Max, she called softly. Max hesitated at the doorway, sniffing the air before turning his head back to John, his eyes filled with something unreadable. And then John's body jerked. A sharp gasp tore from his lips as his hand clutched at the sheets. His breathing hitched, his chest rising and falling rapidly. The monitor started beeping wildly again, but this time, it was different. It wasn't just his heart. His entire body was reacting to something. John! Emily rushed to his side, her hands gripping his arm. Stay with me. John's eyes were open, but they weren't focused. His pupils were dilated, his mouth slightly parted as if he was struggling to speak. And then, just as suddenly, he let out a raspy, trembling whisper, one that sent chills down Emily's spine. He's here? Emily's breath caught in her throat. Who? John struggled to form words, his fingers twitching, his chest heaving. I don't know, he gasped. But I feel him watching. A shiver ran through the room. Dr. Reynolds, who had been frantically adjusting the monitors, froze. He looked between John and Max, his brows furrowed in something that resembled fear. This doesn't make any sense, he said under his breath. And then, as quickly as it had started, John's body relaxed. The tension in his muscles eased, his breathing slowed. The beeping monitor steadied, and just like that, it was over. Max let out a small whimper, stepping forward and pressing his nose against John's arm. Emily, her heart still racing, turned toward Dr. Reynolds. "This isn't just medical anymore," she said quietly. "Something else is happening here." Dr. Reynolds didn't argue. He simply nodded. "I know." John, still catching his breath, weakly turned his head to look at Emily. His voice was barely audible, but the words sent another chill down her spine. "I don't think he's here for me," John whispered. "I think he's here for Max." Silence. Emily felt her stomach drop. "What do you mean?" John swallowed hard. "Every time I felt like I was slipping, Max brought me back. It wasn't just luck, Emily. It wasn't just instinct. He did something." He took a shaky breath. "And now, I think whatever I was being pulled into knows that." Emily's fingers tightened into fists. She glanced at Max, who was still pressed against John's side, his body rigid, his breathing slow and controlled. It was as if he understood every word John was saying. Dr. Reynolds exhaled sharply, rubbing his face. "This is beyond anything I've ever seen." And then the temperature in the room dropped. Emily felt it immediately, a sudden, unnatural chill. Goosebumps rose along her arms, and she instinctively wrapped them around herself. She wasn't alone. She could see the other nurses shift uncomfortably. Max tensed, his ears pinned back, and then the monitor flickered. The steady beeping distorted for a split second, almost like static interference. It was subtle, barely noticeable, but Emily caught it. And so did Max. The golden retriever's entire body stiffened. His eyes locked onto something in the room, something no one else could see. Emily felt her throat go dry. She wasn't sure what was happening, but one thing was certain. Whatever this was, it wasn't over. And Max was at the center of it. Emily's breath hitched as the cold pressed against her skin. The room, once filled with the rhythmic beeping of the monitors, now felt suffocatingly still. Even the air seemed heavier, thicker. She wasn't the only one who noticed it. Dr. Reynolds had stiffened, his eyes scanning the room, and the nurses shifted uncomfortably, exchanging nervous glances. But the only one who truly understood what was happening was Max. The golden retriever stood frozen, his body tense, his gaze locked on a single, empty corner of the room. His ears twitched, his fur bristling slightly, and then a low, deep growl rumbled from his throat. John, still weak, turned his head slowly, following Max's gaze. His breathing was steady now, but his face was pale, his expression unreadable. Then, with a quiet, almost resigned voice, he whispered, "He's still here?" Emily felt her stomach twist. She wanted to deny it, to tell John it was just exhaustion playing tricks on his mind, but she couldn't. Not after everything she had seen. Max let out a sharp bark, his muscles coiled like a spring, ready for something none of them could see. And then, just as suddenly as the chill had come, it was gone. The air grew warm again. The tension in the room eased, like an invisible weight had lifted. The monitor beeped steadily, undisturbed. The nurses let out quiet sighs of relief, trying to shake off whatever strange feeling had just washed over them. But Max didn't move. He stood perfectly still, staring at John. Not at the corner anymore, just at John. His deep brown eyes held something Emily had never seen before. It wasn't fear. It wasn't even confusion. It was a kind of knowing. And then, Max did something that stunned them all. He stepped forward, placed his head gently on John's chest, and let out the softest, saddest whimper. John's fingers slowly ran through Max's fur. He sighed, long and deep, like a man who had finally understood something too big to put into words. Emily felt her throat tighten. "John, what just happened?" John closed his eyes for a moment, his hands still resting on Max's back. When he opened them again, there was something different in them, a clarity that hadn't been there before. "I think I was supposed to go," he admitted quietly. "Both times I felt it, like I was slipping away. But Max, he wouldn't let me." Dr. Reynolds shifted uncomfortably. "John, that doesn't make sense medically. There's no logical explanation for any of this." John gave a tired smile. "No, there isn't." He looked down at Max, "But that doesn't mean it isn't real." Emily swallowed hard, her heart pounding in her chest. And the presence? The one you said wasn't here for you? John exhaled. I don't know what it was, but I do know one thing. His fingers curled slightly into Max's fur. Max wasn't just saving me. His voice dropped to almost a whisper. He was fighting something off. Silence. Max finally pulled back and sat down, his tail resting against the floor. He wasn't tense anymore, but there was still something deeply solemn about the way he sat there, watching John. Emily had spent years in hospitals. She had seen people battle for their lives. She had seen loss, grief, hope, and recovery. But she had never seen anything like this. John had been on the brink of death. Twice. And both times, Max had pulled him back. And somehow, something had noticed. Days passed, and John's health continued to improve. The doctors still couldn't explain it. His body had stabilized in a way that defied every medical expectation. They called it a miracle, but Emily knew better. She spent a lot of time with Max after that, walking him outside, sitting with him in the quiet hospital corridors. She watched him closely, waiting for any sign that something was still wrong. But Max was just Max again, happy, loving, loyal, as if nothing had ever happened. But she knew it had. The day John was finally discharged, Max trotted beside him, his tail wagging, his eyes bright. The hospital staff gathered around to say their goodbyes, still whispering about the dog that had somehow defied medical logic. John smiled as he reached the exit, looking down at Max. You ready to go home, buddy? Max barked once, a happy, eager sound. Emily walked beside them, her heart still heavy with unspoken questions. But as John stepped out into the fresh air, she saw something shift in him. He looked lighter, freer, like a man who had been given a second chance and knew exactly how rare that was. She hesitated before speaking. John, do you think it's over? John glanced at her, then at Max. His smile was small but certain. Yeah, he said. I think whatever was trying to take me, it lost. Emily exhaled slowly, watching as Max trotted ahead, his golden fur glowing under the sunlight. She didn't know what had happened in that hospital room. She didn't know if Max had truly fought something off, or if it had just been coincidence, fate, or something beyond human understanding. But one thing was clear. John was still here, and Max, his best friend, his protector, had made sure of it. As they walked away, the wind shifted gently, rustling through the trees. Max paused for a second, his ears twitching, his eyes scanning the distance. Then, just like that, he turned back to John and kept walking. Whatever had come for him, whatever had lingered in the darkness, it was gone now. And they were finally free.